for thousands of deaths in the region. Well, Robin Sanders is a former U.S. ambassador to Nigeria and the Republic of Congo and a former Africa director at the U.S. National Security Council. She's joining us now from Washington, D.C. It's very good to have you with us on Al Jazeera. Thank you very much indeed. Our correspondent Malcolm there was just saying that there are concerns that instead of actually stabilising this situation, it could cause it to spread out. What do you think has to be done to avoid that happening?
I think that not only do the neighbors, but certainly the international community has to keep an eye on this. Clearly, in the package that you just presented, it highlighted that, in the late 1990s up until 2003, you had a real conflict in Eastern Congo that included Uganda and Rwandan troops. And so there is a worry that it could default back into that kind of major conflict. The difference this time, however, is that you have an agreement, so to speak, between the Ugandan government and the current president of DRC to not only provide artillery cover, but also come in on the ground troop level. The question will be whether or not they can contain the activities of the Ugandan troops and whether or not the civilians in the area will feel more secure or less secure with the Ugandan presence there. I think there's mixed views. You have certainly relatives from the earlier war in that part of the Congo that are concerned about Uganda coming back in, wondering whether or not they will leave again or they will add to a wider spread of the conflict. But overall, I think that we have a responsibility, the neighbors as well as the international community, to pay attention to this, to be engaged with both governments on monitoring this. And in addition, back in the early 2000s, there was incredible human rights abuses as part of that. So the question will be to pay attention to not only the wider conflict, making sure that doesn't happen, but also to make sure that human rights violations don't happen by either side.
It's one thing, of course, as you say, for the international community to pay attention to it. It's another thing to want to take action in the event that the scenarios that you're talking about, the human rights violations, are carried out. Or, for example, if there is a risk that this could spread further. Is there any mileage, do you think, that there would be some foreign troops eventually that would have to be on the ground in order to work as peacekeeping troops, for example, in order to be able to contain and control not only the armed group, but of course the military of Congo and also Uganda?
I think that what I'm talking about when I say pay attention, it's all of those elements. I don't think right now there's an appetite for troops outside of the region or troops outside of a UN framework to come in. I don't think we're there yet, and I don't think that we want to jump to that as the next step. I think that the next step is to really engage first on the diplomatic front, making sure that we're all talking to the leaders of both countries so that they understand the seriousness or the potential for this to get out of hand. Back in the early 2000s, it became one of I guess, Africa's, greater civil wars, where you had five countries with troops in Congo at the same time, based on the first conflict. We don't want to see that happen again because it took from 1998 to 2003 to get that back in the box. So the key will be to engage, to have dialogue, but also keep an eye on whether or not the collective international community needs to go back to the UN to see whether or not a greater peacekeeping force needs to come in. And to also pay attention to what the civil society and the local people that live in that region. They've suffered through this before. You have concerns by a number of groups, civilian groups in that area, about this divulging again into what we saw in late 1999 up through 2003.
Given your extensive experience in the region, do you have a feeling that the military of Congo and also Uganda are capable of carrying out this particular attack, and that will essentially nip it in the bud, that will stop things? Or do you think that it is going to enter a period of attrition, essentially, that this is just going to be the start of a series of actions like this?
I think there are possibilities for both scenarios that you mentioned. The one that worries me most, and the one that I keep an eye on, coming out of a national security background, is the influence of ISIL and the role and the goals of ISIL in this fight. We know that they are already linked to ADF. They have been for some time. Are we going to have elements from other former wars like Syria and Afghanistan also coming into the fight? And I think that's general for the entire continent. I don't think we're paying enough attention to the growth of ISIL and other Islamic elements that are coming into the African continent. And this is just another example. So we've got to keep our eye not only on whether or not a lot of foreign troops are coming that are connected to ISIL or coming more into the area. We've got to make sure that the diplomatic engagement stays on track. We've got to make sure that the UN is also engaged in terms of whether or not it's something that will require a peacekeeping force to go in, and then on the human rights front. So, when you're an analyst on a region that big and on a country that big, you've got to take in at least 5 to 6 possibilities that might be out there. Hopefully, the goal of starting this in the first place is to contain ADF and its ISIL affiliates, but we all have to pay attention to whether or not that's going to happen, and we have to listen to the civilians and the reports coming out of the region as to what's actually going on the ground.
Really appreciate your analysis of this, Robin Sanders. Thank you very much indeed for being with us on Al Jazeera.
Pleasure, as always.